one of the charities, and we just knew about it. The Klausenberger Rebbe, Laniardo. I remember when I was in school spieling for them on Purim, we actually, I think, managed to donate a pediatric monitor, which sounded really fancy. I'm not sure actually what that was.
That's good.
But, when we were younger. And the truth is, some charities have amazing people both working for them and amazing people who started them. Now, if you remember, we had Ellie Beer grace our community not too long ago. So this is one of those stories. Firstly, those who don't know Simon and all the work he does, it's fantastic. And those who don't know Laniardo as well, it's fantastic. In fact, I'll give you the proof that it's fantastic, because if you look just behind me, protruding from the windowsill in Stanwell Shul office, there is a Laniardo Stocker box. Over there. You see, we don't have many of them over here, but there's a Laniardo Stocker box, which I should probably drop round to you, Simon, in the days where we can legally do so. Simon's doing fantastic work, and the story of the Klausenberger Rebbe is it's just a heartwarming, not an easy story, but just a heartwarming story of what someone can bounce back from and bounce back to. So I'm going to hand you the mic, and all over to you, Simon.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Fine. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I believe I've actually probably spoken to some of you before, because I recently, well, not recently, within the last few months, spoke to the Sapphire group at Stanwell Shul. So I don't know if any of you were in that shir at that time. That was a few months ago, but very happy to see you all again, and I hopefully I'll be doing something new. As you can see, we're starting with a picture of Laniardo Hospital. As you can see, it's very beautiful and sunny and right by the beach, you know, and that's actually only half. All you can see in the picture there is really actually only half the hospital, and probably actually since that picture's been taken, we've expanded, we've added on a few new departments. There's an underground dialysis center, and there's a new maternity center, and you know, we sort of call ourselves, the hospital calls itself the hospital that never starts growing, which might not be the most snazzy catchphrase in the world ever, but it is actually true. You know, we've got plans for the future, and the hospital's growing, and thank God it's a wonderful place which we should only ever know and use for good reasons, and we'll hopefully come to that a little bit later, when we discuss the fact that the hospital at normal times helps deliver about 800 births a month. So it's a really fantastic place. It's a really special place, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But first of all, we're going to talk more about the Klausenberger Rebbe, the rabbi, the person who started the hospital. And I'm going to attempt to change the background picture now. So I'm not the most tech person in the world ever, so you'll have to bear with me, and hopefully I won't lose you all. That's the hospital again, and that's still the hospital. Okay, this is the Klausenberger Rebbe. Here we go. That's the picture I wanted, not this one, this one. So this is the Klausenberger Rebbe. This is one of the oldest pictures of him in his youth. So for those of you who don't know, this very Hasidic looking gentleman is the Klausenberger Rebbe. He is the man who started Laniardo Hospital in 1975, but the antecedents, the idea of Laniardo Hospital was actually formulated in the fires of the Holocaust, because the Klausenberger Rebbe, during his time, and maybe because of his pain and experience that he experienced during the Holocaust, that was what motivated him to create this place, this hospital, Laniardo, which would be a place predicated on life and love for humanity and kindness and care for one's fellow human being. And it was out of that terrible, terrible situation that the Klausenberger Rebbe faced during the Holocaust that Laniardo came into being. So with that in mind, I want to go back in history a little bit, and we're going to talk about who he was, where he came from, and why he eventually ended up deciding to build a hospital, of all things. A pretty unusual thing for a Hasidic rabbi to decide to do. So he was born in 1905, and he was born in Hungary, and he was born in a town called Klausenberg. Now, Klausenberg, for those of you who don't know, is one of these kind of border towns in Eastern Europe. It's actually in modern-day Romania. It's known today as Cluj. And if anyone follows football, a few years ago, Manchester United played a European, I don't know, Champions League something game against FC Cluj, which I think they won. And Cluj is the Romanian name for Klausenberg, but back then it was in Hungary, and it was one of these towns which all, you know, you could go to sleep one night and be in Hungary and wake up the next morning and, you know, the border's changed and you're in Romania or Slovakia or somewhere like that. So it was with that background that in 1905 he was born, and he was born into a very great Hasidic dynasty on both sides. He was the great grandson of the founder of a very famous Hasidic sect called Sands. He was the great grandson of the Divrei Chaim of Sands, who was himself known as being an extremely righteous man, and that was on his father's side. And on his mother's side, he was actually descended from the Bnei Yissaschar, who was also a very well-known Hasidic leader in pre-war Europe. And he had this incredible background, and from a very young age, he was known as an Ilui, which means a brilliant genius. He was a very lucid, intelligent man. He was able to understand, even at a young age, able to understand difficult aspects of Torah, different halakhic ideas in Torah, and even started writing from a young age. And at the I think he was only in his 20s when sadly he was actually 27. He was actually 27 when his father passed away, and he became, at that age, at the age of 27, the Rav of Klausenberg. Now, Klausenberg was a town of about, which had a Jewish population of about 16,000. So it had a very, very large, very sizable Jewish community. Most of the community were either communist, secularist, Zionist, and the actual religious community was very, very small. Now, he was one of these people who he didn't really look at other people in terms of judging them for how religious they were, how not religious they were. He just loved every Jew, and every Jew was welcome in his home. And this love for every Jew and every person really came across to everybody, and even people who were not religious or maybe even anti-religious, they had an immense amount of respect for him. And there's a very famous story of his rabbi, his personal attendant, who before he became his personal attendant, he had a shop which he opened on Shabbat. And one time the rabbi was walking past the shop and he saw the owner of the shop with the shop open on Shabbat, and the rabbi was the owner of the shop was kind of goading him and asking if he wants to come in and buy anything, you know, teasing him really. And the rabbi spoke to him with such love and such kindness that the man himself actually decided to close his shop, and he built a relationship with the Klausenberger Rebbe, and many years later he actually became the personal attendant of the Klausenberger Rebbe, simply because he showed him this immense amount of love and kindness. And you know, as the years passed, in the late 20s and early 30s, he very soon became known as one of the preeminent halakhic authorities in pre-war Europe. And he also wrote extensively, and he has a sefer, a book of halakhic responsa, which you can still get. It's in Hebrew, and it's not easy. It's not easy to follow, and it's not easy to learn. It's called Divrei Yatziv, but it is available, and it's all of his halakhic responsa on all sorts of halakhic issues. And it's one of these halakhic responsa which are still learnt very extensively in yeshivas and in religious communities till today. And as the winds of war became darker and Europe began to move in the late 30s towards war, people would come to him for counsel. They would come to him and ask questions of what they should do, and come to him for advice. Difficult halakhic questions from all over Europe would come to him, and he would endeavor to do his best to try to answer and to give advice and to give chizuk, to give encouragement to people, which was just very difficult. Not just people in his locale, not just people in his town, but all over Europe, people would write to him and want advice. And it was obviously a very, very difficult situation. And at the time that the war broke out, everyone was doing their best to try and survive and try and decide what would be the best thing to do. And he was trying to advise people, but obviously, sadly for him, even himself, he wasn't able to save his wife and his children. When the war broke out, he was married. He had 11 children. Unfortunately, sadly, as someone mentioned earlier, by the time the war was over, he'd lost all of his children, and his wife had also passed away, sadly, during the Holocaust. And he said, actually, at the end of the war, when everything had passed, he said, "I've lost everything, but I have not lost Hashem." So he still, and that was one of the themes throughout his entire Holocaust experience, throughout his entire life, really, was that he was able to maintain his emunah, his belief, his trust, and his love for Hashem despite everything that happened. And it was this connection that he had to Hashem, to God, that really spurred him on, not just to survive the war, but also to be so dedicated to rebuilding not just Laniado Hospital, as we'll discuss later, but many, many other Torah institutions, yeshivas, schools, his care for the poor and the needy, and eventually moving to Israel and building Laniado and communities within Israel, in Jerusalem and in Netanya, which were founded by him or through his followers, which were very, became very significant communities. So as the war, maybe I don't know when I should stop and answer questions. Maybe we'll stop for a sec. If anyone wants to raise a hand, I believe you can do that on Zoom. If anyone wants to ask a question, then I'm happy to take a question. Rabbi Fine, I don't know if anyone's asking a question, you can unmute them.
Yeah, keep going. I would keep going. I think that maybe the
keep
question.
Keep cracking on. Okay.
Yeah, you're doing great.
Excuse to rest my voice. Okay, so fine. As the war continued, so the war began. He was in Hungary, which actually, as it turns out, at the beginning of the war, at least, was one of the better places to be. He avoided the Nazis for a number of years. He avoided concentration camps, and he avoided work details. He along with his family was departed. He was departed from his mother's family at the beginning of the war. They were stuck in Poland, and they sadly were murdered earlier on in the war. But he, with his family, were in Hungary, and they were really escaping from town to town for most of the early years of the war. And the truth is, there's not a lot that's known about him. Between 1941 and 1944, we don't know a lot about what happened to him during these years. Hungary itself was a Nazi protectorate, and Hungary itself, the liquidation of the ghettos in Hungary and the transports of the Jews to the concentration camps and the death camps didn't actually begin until 1944. And so Hungary, which had a very sizable Jewish population of about 450,000 Jews at the beginning of the war, most of those Jews were not transported to concentration camps until much later in the war. It really began for the Jews of Hungary in 1944. It was really 1944, March 1944, when the Nazis invaded Hungary, and it was at that point that they started making mass transportations of Jews from the Jewish communities to Auschwitz, and the transports were unimaginable numbers. 10,000 Jews a day during the summer of 1944 were transported from their homes, from where they were, to Auschwitz, and so much so that the rate of transportation was so great that there's actually documentation from the Nazis at Auschwitz writing to the Nazis in Hungary, telling them to stop, to slow down, because they can't process these numbers. There were just too many people coming too quickly. So you get an idea for how the incredible rate of transportation that must have been. When Rabbi Halberstam, the Klausenberger Rebbe, was first transported to Auschwitz, he was immediately put on a work detail, but sadly, on June 2nd, 1944, his wife and 9 of his 11 children were immediately murdered. So that was obviously one of the hardest things that he had to deal with in his life. It was an immense tragedy, and he was very, very hurt and very, very broken because of it. Despite all of the trials and tribulations, the difficulties that he went through, he was very, very dedicated to not breaking halakha. He wouldn't eat anything that was not kosher. The entire time that he was in Auschwitz or in any of the Nazi death camps, he was very dedicated to keeping kosher. Now, what was interesting about that, I was just reading earlier, was that even though he was dedicated himself, he wouldn't touch anything which was treif, that was not kosher. He told other people that you have to look after yourselves, you have to keep your strength up. Whatever they give you, you're allowed to eat. You're allowed to eat non-kosher food because you have to look after your physical health. You have to look after your body. But he himself wouldn't. He wouldn't touch anything that was not kosher. And there are amazing stories about, he was starving. He was at death's door, as many, if not most, of the prisoners were. There were many stories about how he was able to find food and how he was able to keep kosher during the years of the Holocaust, and the incredible self-sacrifice that he went through during that time to keep kosher was really quite mind-boggling. And not just that either. Other mitzvahs which he was incredibly dedicated to keeping. He had a pair of tefillin, which he tried to wear every day. He tried to daven as much as possible. He was very, very dedicated to the idea of davening. And Shabbat also, he was not willing to transgress Shabbat, even though on many occasions it almost cost him his life. There was one famous incident where he applied to trade jobs with somebody else so that he wouldn't have to carry on Shabbos. Now, you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos, so he didn't want to carry on Shabbos. So he asked to swap jobs to do something else which wouldn't involve a Shabbos desecration. And as a result of that, the guards found out and they beat him so much so that they thought he was dead. The reason they stopped beating him was because they thought he was already dead, but he wasn't dead and he managed to survive, as we know. So he had a terrible time while he was in Auschwitz. He actually wasn't in Auschwitz for terribly long. Sorry, it's my son. He wasn't in Auschwitz for terribly long. He was only in Auschwitz. He was only in Auschwitz for a number of weeks, about 6 weeks during the summer of 1944, and after that he was then put on a transport from Auschwitz, which is in the south of Poland. As many of you know, I'm sure many of you have been on trips to Poland to see the Jewish heritage in Poland and Auschwitz and Krakow and whatnot. He was taken from Auschwitz along with many other prisoners, and he was put in this work detail. He was taken north to Warsaw. And interestingly, what he was asked to do was to go through with thousands of other prisoners and slave laborers. He was asked to go through the rubble of the Warsaw ghetto and to look for anything of value that the Nazis could use for their war effort. The Nazis thought that the Jews had buried treasure or buried money or whatever it was in the Warsaw ghetto, and he, along with thousands of other slave laborers, was given the job of literally on their hands and knees sifting through the rubble. In the Polish summer, which is hot and unpleasant, he was given that job along with many thousands of other slave laborers, and it was a difficult job. And as the summer drew on, 1944, the Russians were moving in from the east, and the Germans were beginning their retreat back into Germany. And part of their retreat included moving all of their slave laborers from Poland back into Germany, and thousands upon thousands of Jews and other slave laborers were put on death marches, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And the Klausenberger Rebbe himself, in the summer of 1944, was put on a death march in the month of Av. It was actually, the death march began on Friday, the 8th of Av, and this was in 1944. And in the middle of the Polish summer, 6,000 slave laborers began their march from Warsaw, which is in the north of Poland, to Dachau, which is in the south of Germany. And of those 6,000 slave laborers from all different nations, obviously not just Jews, only 2,000 were to survive. And they were put on this march, and it was terrible, dreadful, unimaginable pain and suffering that they suffered during this time. They were starved, they were beaten, they were not given food to eat or water to drink, and they were marched about 20 miles a day. And in the scorching Polish summer, it was a time we can't even really begin to imagine. And you can imagine the Klausenberger Rebbe himself. He was starved. He was, he'd lost everything. He'd lost his Hasidus. He'd lost his Talmidim, his students. He'd lost his wife and his children. And here he is on this death knell. And as the march continued, it was actually Tisha B'Av, which is the day itself, the 9th of Av in Jewish calendar, the middle of the summer, where we as Jews every year, we mourn the two Beit HaMikdash, the two temples in Jerusalem which were destroyed. And we take on at that point, on that day every year, we take on certain customs of mourning. We fast, we don't eat or drink, we don't wear leather shoes, we don't bathe. And amazingly also, and this gives you a clue to his genius, that the Klausenberger himself was able to have in mind to remember the Jewish calendar, which is an incredible thing. That he was just the fact that he was able to remember when Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, was is quite incredible. But he was on this death march, and he remembered it was Tisha B'Av, and he remembered that one of the customs of Tisha B'Av was to not wear leather shoes. So while he was on the march, he actually took off his leather shoes, which was an incredible thing if you think about it, because he was in such incredible pain that he would even be willing to take off his shoes, but he was so dedicated to keeping halakha, keeping Jewish law, that this was something that was important to him, and it was something that he wanted to do. So he took off his leather shoes. And one of the Nazis at that time saw him do this, and he must have realized that this was some sort of Jewish custom. And he obviously saw it as, this Nazi saw it as some sort of rebellion, and he made the Klausenberger Rebbe march alongside the column. And it was alongside the column, it wasn't like a perfect paved road, it was a kind of embankment of broken stones, and the Klausenberger Rebbe was made to march along at this time. He was made to march along this embankment, and you can only imagine his feet must have been sore and cut. And at one point during this march, one of the guards, the Nazi guards, thought that the Klausenberger Rebbe was trying to escape. They thought he was trying to sort of dart down this embankment. So it was at that point that one of these guards took out his gun and he shot the Rebbe. He shot the Klausenberger Rebbe, and he shot him in the arm. And the Rebbe tumbled down the embankment and banged into a tree. And it was at that point he took bark off the tree and placed it on the arm, wrapped it with a leaf to try and stem the bleeding. And it was at that point when the Klausenberger Rebbe himself was probably at his lowest point. I mean, I don't know how a person can really get any lower. He lost his wife and family. He was on this death march. He'd been shot in the arm, starved, beaten, unimaginable pain. It was at that point that he swore an oath, and he said to God that if I survive this war, if I make it to the land of Israel, then I'll build a hospital, and that hospital will be dedicated to life. It will be dedicated to goodness. And in the same way that these Nazis have done everything that they can to take all goodness, all kindness, all love and tolerance out of the world, I'm going to build a place which will be dedicated to putting those values, those Jewish values of love and kindness and tolerance. And this hospital will be available for everybody without care of what race or religion they are. And obviously, you know, here now, almost 75 years later, we're looking at Laniado, and that is the culmination of his dream, that he was able to build that place, and that is Laniado. So, which we'll get to in due course. Sort of got my eye on the clock, and there's not as much time left as I would like. I think we've got till 1:45. Is that right? Am I fine?
Yeah, around then. We started a few minutes late there.
Okay, good. So okay, as the war continued, the Klausenberger Rebbe did in fact make it to Dachau, and he was in Dachau. He survived until liberation. Sadly, his last surviving son actually also did survive war, but died shortly after the war. I don't know if he was in the concentration camp or if he was in a displaced persons camp, but he died sadly just after the war. Typhus. Typhus was one of the biggest killers during the war, and his last son died sadly of typhus. The Klausenberger Rebbe after the war was assigned to a displaced persons camp near Dachau, near Munich in the south of Germany, called Feldafing. He was in Feldafing displaced persons camp for about a year until he eventually made his way to America. He first went to America and then onto Israel in 1960. But there are many interesting stories about his time in Feldafing displaced persons camp. And I could definitely fill the rest of the 15-20 minutes that we have left of just about the stories which he went through during that time. But just to give you one or two, he was really the de facto leader of the religious Jews in Feldafing displaced persons camp, but he was very much respected by all the Jews. So much so that Eisenhower at one point came to visit Feldafing, and he wanted to meet the leaders of the various groups in Feldafing. And he met the Klausenberger Rebbe, and he was very impressed with the Klausenberger Rebbe, even though I don't think the Klausenberger Rebbe ever spoke English. I'm not actually sure. I don't think he ever learned English, but he was very impressed with him, and he asked the Klausenberger Rebbe, he asked him, is there anything I can do for you? So he said, Klausenberger said, yes, we have our festival of Sukkot, which is coming up, and we need arbor minim. We need the 4 species, the lulav, the etrog, the hadassim, and the arabus, the willow and the myrtle. And it's part of our festival, and we don't have them. And you know, can you arrange to bring them to us so that we can fulfill the mitzvah of arbor minim of the 4 species on Sukkot? And the story goes that Eisenhower himself commandeered his own private jet and sent it to Calabria in Italy, where the arbor minim grow, and he had the arbor minim brought to the Jews in Feldafing so that they could shake arbor minim on Sukkot. That's one story, and then after that, so Eisenhower asked him for a bracha. He says he saw that the Rebbe was a holy man. He said, "Can you give me a blessing?" And so he said to Eisenhower, "We'll go from level to an even higher level." And Eisenhower said, "What are you talking about? I'm already head of the entire American army. There's nowhere else for me to go." And so obviously we know that history played out, that Eisenhower in the 50s became the president of the United States. So while he was in Feldafing, also just another amazing thing that he did, one of the first jobs he did was that he was involved in the mitzvah of Mace Mitzvah, which is the mitzvah to bury the dead. He commandeered an American Jeep and an American GI, and he literally just went around the local area. Look, sadly there were just bodies everywhere, and he wanted to fulfill the mitzvah of burying the dead, which is an important mitzvah, having respect for the departed. And he went from, and it was at that point, he put so much time and energy into that, it almost killed him, because he also contracted typhus at that time, and he was again on his deathbed, and he did recover, but he almost died even at that time. Just one other story I could tell you about this time. It was an incredible time for him. He was very much involved in arranging the physical and spiritual needs of the Jews in the displaced persons camp. There was no kosher kitchen there at the time, so he set up a kosher kitchen. They didn't have tzitzits, they didn't have prayer books, they didn't have Chumashim, they didn't have Siddur, they didn't have anything. And so he wrote to the Gedolim, the Torah leaders in America, and he told them that we don't have any of our Jewish the things that we need, and he arranged for them to be sent over. And finally, when it came to Yom Kippur, he also he led the services over Yom Kippur, and there was a very beautiful story, a very sad story really, on Erev Yom Kippur. There's custom for parents to give a blessing to their children, and it's found in the beginning of most machzorim. If you look in the beginning of your Yom Kippur machzor, you'll see there's a traditional blessing that a father and a mother give to their children, and it's not short. I mean, it only takes 2 minutes to read, but it's not just one line. It's like it's a hefty paragraph, and there was one. Obviously, there were sadly lots of orphans in the camp, and one of these orphans came up to the Rebbe, and he said to the Rebbe, I don't know where my mummy and daddy are. I'm here alone. No one's here to give me the blessing that is normally given at the time. So the Klausenberger Rebbe said, well, it's okay, I'll give you the blessing. And he gave the child the blessing, and other orphans sadly saw what was going on, and the story goes he gave the blessing to over 500 children at that time on Erev Yom Kippur, just before Yom Kippur came in. So yeah, it gives you an idea of his own personal greatness and another aspect of the sad tragedy that was the Holocaust. We're going to stop now. I'm going to try and I don't know if it's going to work. I'm going to try and show a video which will give you a bit more of a broader idea of what we've been discussing, and then I'll speak for a little bit more. And if there's time, if I find lets me, I'll play another video. So, but we'll try with this one first. We'll see if it works. There's all my emails. Here we go. Can you see that? Here we go. Can you see that? Can you hear that? Is that working?
Nothing so far.
No. Can you see it, or you can't hear it? You can't hear anything?
Nothing so far.
Oh, that's weird. Okay. I don't know why. Give it a sec. It took us. Well, okay. Hopefully this will pop up in a second. Hopefully this will pop up in a second. Let's just. I'll continue speaking, and hopefully you'll give me a thumbs up if it pops up on your screen anytime soon. Right. So we'll talk about the hospital a little bit more then. We'll talk about the hospital. Hold on, actually. Maybe if I do this. No, don't know. Okay.
Do you want me to have a go?
Yeah. If you can play one of those links from yours, maybe that will.
I don't know if the sound will work, but let's at least.
I don't know. We'll give it a go. Nothing to lose.
Okay.
And maybe if I stop sharing and then you share, maybe that will work.
All right, go on. You continue.
Okay. So yeah. So where are we? So yeah, after the war, the rabbi he moved from. He was in Germany. Obviously, he went to America and he set up in Union City, which is in New Jersey. And he was immediately. He didn't let his own personal tragedy stop him from his lifetime goal now, which was rebuilding. And his whole efforts after the war were. There we are. Okay, should we see if this works?
Yeah. Do you want me to play it now?
Yeah, go on. Yeah, go on. Give it a go. Let's see what happens. I can't hear anything.
Yeah.
Can you hear a little bit now? Can you try turning the sound up on yours?
Yeah. Okay, hold on. I'm going to try it one more time and see if I can do the sound. You keep speaking. We're going to go for one more time. Go for it.
All right. Okay. So he moved to Union City, and he was. Sorry, second.
Yeah, keep going. Keep going.
So he moved to Union City. He was immediately involved in building yeshivas, helping the poor, looking after people, rebuilding communities, and he did that for until 1960. When at 1960 he began to begin his move to Israel, and he eventually moved and he founded the Kiryat Sands community, which is in Netanya. There's a whole story why he chose Netanya, which we don't have time for now, unfortunately. Maybe talk about it another time. But he founded Kiryat Sands community in Netanya, and he began doing what the normal things which you would expect Hasidic rabbis to do: building yeshivas, kollel, schools, and looking after the poor, looking after his Hasidim. And it was also at this time that he was dedicated to this concept of the hospital. The hospital was his Kodesh Kadoshim, his Holy of Holies. That was what he wanted to do. So
sorry to interject.
Yeah, go ahead. Not at all. Go ahead. Let's see if it works. Yeah, go ahead.
When I came in the 80s, I was very impressed by the fact that a Hasidic rabbi would build a hospital. He was a very kind, very good-hearted, and very open person. And I was lucky enough to know him while he was still alive. He wrote of how he viewed this hospital should be run. The excellence in professionalism, nursing and medical. At all costs, you should respect life and you should maintain life. The patient had a say and should be involved in his care. There was a special presence here, special aura that was connected to the love of life, to the quality of life that we were expected to give to our patients. And it was very much connected to the Rebbe's past experiences during the Holocaust.
It was a death march. Soldiers came and they shot the Rebbe. They shot him in his hand and he dropped on the floor and acted he was dead. As soon as the soldiers and the prisoners left, bleeding profusely, he got up and he saw a tree next to him. He tore off a couple of leaves and branches and he made a tourniquet, and this way he stopped his bleeding and actually saved his life. And at that very moment, he made a vow. Holy God, if I ever get out of this life hell, I promise I am going to build an institution to heal the sick, to alleviate pain. The Rebbe recruited the whole staff and spoke to them. I do not expect of you to be religious, but to be compassionate to the patients, to treat each patient like it's your own child.
This hospital is different. The Rebbe instilled in each and every person that ever came to work here a love for humanity. You love a non-Jew as much as you love a Jew. We must save and heal a human being, no matter who the human being is. And we committed ourselves to this task. And this is the same policy that's followed in Laniaro Hospital till this very day.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so that gives you a bit more of a broader. I hope you got something out of that video. It's a little bit judgy on mine, but basically it was okay. So I hope you got something out of that video. One other thing, yeah, a few other things we could talk about. So yes, it took him until 1975 to get the funds together to start the hospital, and when the hospital started, it was, you know, very much it was very much a local hospital. They only had 24 beds. It was more of a sort of local medical centre, really, and it took a while for them to get a bit more money. And as they got a bit more money together, they built a maternity department, and when they had a bit more money after that, they built a dialysis department, and the hospital just grew and grew and grew and grew, and until today, where we have over 400 beds. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a very busy, thank God, a very busy maternity department, one of the busiest maternity departments in the country. Just to give you an idea, we have over 800 births a month, and that works out about 8 or 9,000 births a year on average. To give you a bit of an idea, the UCH has only about 6,000 births a year, and the Royal Free has only about 5,000 births a year. So we're, thank God, a very busy hospital. There's a lot of medical research, which is very exciting medical research, especially into diabetes and other diseases, which goes on over there. The Klausenberger Rebbe, unfortunately, he died in 1994, so just short of his 90th birthday. I think he was 89 when he died, and also very sad. So he remarried after the war. He had another 4 children, 4 sons, and very sadly, his second wife just passed away a few weeks ago. She lived in America, and she passed away just a few weeks ago in the States. Not COVID-19 related, I don't believe, but she was 97 years old, and she literally just passed away just now. Yeah, I hope that was all interesting. I just want if you have a minute, I'll take some questions as well if anybody would like to ask. One other very nice story. When they eventually got the money together to build the maternity department, so the hospital expanded. I don't think they managed to finish the maternity department until 1984. So quite a few years after the hospital was first built. So they built the maternity department, and after it was built, the rabbi came to the staff in that department. And by the way, actually, I didn't mention this. He was extremely hands-on during the running of the hospital. He wasn't a medical person, but any halakhic questions, the hospital has always been run along halakhic lines, and any halakhic questions or ethical questions, anything which came up on a day-to-day basis, which they needed his advice, he had an office in the hospital, and he was available, and people would come and ask him questions. And he said to them, after the maternity department was first built, he said to them, you know, when the first mother comes in and gives birth to a baby, you know, I want you to tell me immediately. And he was very strong about it, and he told them, you know, as soon as the baby's born, please tell me, I want to know immediately. And they were like, yeah, okay, fine, we'll tell you. And I don't know how long it was after the department was first built that the first mother arrived, and she gave birth, and mazel tov. I don't know if it was a boy or a girl. And after the baby was born and everything they saw was healthy, so they called the rabbi and they phoned him up, and they said to him, you know, you wanted us to tell you when the first baby was born, so we're calling you to tell you the baby's been born. And they heard some sort of like crying basically at the other end of the line. And, you know, Israelis being like a little bit close to it, you know, they said, like, why are you crying? So he said, you don't understand. He said, Zeh hanakama sheli. This is my revenge. This is my revenge against Hitler. That this hospital that we built, life overcomes death, goodness overcomes hatred, tolerance overcomes destruction. And that is really the message of Laniado. The message of Laniado till today is this message of love of life, care for the individual, no matter who that person is. And yeah, happy to stick around, take a few questions. If anyone wants to find out more about who we are and what we do, you can always go to our website, which is laniado.co.uk. Yeah, happy to. We've got another video. I don't know if the last one was okay. It was just about okay on mine. So I don't know if you want to play another one. It's a bit longer the second one, so maybe not such a good idea. But if anyone wants to ask a question, then I'm here, happy to take questions and discuss it a bit more.
Just want to say a massive thank you to Simon, really, for joining us. I know I can speak from my own experiences that lockdown with a family, thank God you're blessed with families, but with kids and etc. It's not that easy. So thank you very much for sparing your time. It's also incredible just hearing the story that the Klausenberger Rebbe could like keep his head, so to speak. In other words, to be able to keep, his Torah knowledge and later to like give halachic decisions about hospitals and life and death situations after what he'd gone through is just unbelievable. Just mentally, intellectually, emotionally, it's just it's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing which I can't get my head around is how he was able to hold on to the Jewish calendar. That he was able to remember when the holidays were and when even minor, so to speak, holidays, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, that he was able to hold that information, with everything, the beatings and all of the other things that were going on with him, how he was able to do that was unbelievable. Yeah, very, 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 it's completely incredible.
Okay. All right. Wow. So if anyone does have any questions, but it sounds like Simon's basically covered everything. So now.
Oh no, there's loads more. I could talk for hours. I've got loads more stories. I mean, I can keep on going if people want. I don't know if this lady, someone here's got their hand up, I think.
Yeah, just unmute yourself if you've got a question.
You got to unmute, Mr.
Yes.
Hello.
Are his sons that were involved in the hospital?
Yes, actually, his son, who is the current Klausenberger Rebbe in Netanya, is also head of the hospital, and his name is Rabbi Elimelech Tzvi Halberstam, his oldest son. So he is very much involved on a day-to-day level. Again, both in the running of the hospital, answering halakhic and moral ethical questions about the hospital, also in regards to anything which might be, fundraising. He's involved in that as well, obviously. So he's very involved. Someone's asked on the chat, how did Laniado get its name? So it's also quite an interesting question, quite an interesting answer. Laniado, there were two brothers. They were Swiss Syrian bankers, and I think they both died without leaving any children, and they made a lot of money, and they decided they wanted to leave the bulk of their wealth, I don't know if all of it or part of it. They decided they wanted to leave a large endowment to build a hospital in Israel, and that hospital that received the money became Laniado Hospital. So that's how it's got this quite unusual name. It was a dedication.
Amazing. I actually always wondered that Laniado doesn't sound like a name from Eastern Europe.
No, not at all. I think there was. You can Google. They're on Wikipedia. I googled them quite recently, actually. They were like Swiss Syrian bankers. I think they gave money to other. Very successful. I don't think it was just Laniado. They gave money to lots of other things as well.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Why Netanya? So on the chat, somebody's asked why Netanya. Okay, so the story that I've heard why Netanya is a bit of a complicated one. Anyone who knows their Israel geography will know that Netanya is actually on it's the thinnest part of Israel between the Green Line and the sea. So I think it's only like 9 miles or something from the sea to the Green Line. So strategically, it's in a very precarious position. And actually, as a result of that, during the Intifada, the first Intifada, and especially the second Intifada, Netanya was the second most attacked town in all of Israel after Jerusalem. Had the highest number of terrorist incidents in all of Israel after Jerusalem. So I'm sure everyone remembers the Park Hotel disaster, but there were many others as well. But why Netanya? So the rabbi realized that strategically Netanya was in a very precarious position. So he felt he wanted to build Netanya not just physically but also spiritually, and he decided that if we put a religious settlement in Netanya, where there will be yeshivas and people learning Torah, and there might, as a result of that, be some sort of spiritual protection for Israel, for all of Israel, as a result of all of the Torah and mitzvahs which were going to be learned, and the mitzvahs which would be done in that area. And hopefully that would give some extra sort of spiritual protection to not just the Netanya, but to all of Israel. That was his thinking. So yeah, I hope that answers that one. Are there any other questions? I'm always happy to answer.
Amazing. Okay. I think it looks like that's it. But thank you, Simon, again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And to remind me, I have to bring this Stucker box to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.